Hi everyone, welcome to our free prep hour. I'm going to give folks just a minute to join and then we'll get started. As you are coming in, I would love to get to know a little bit about you. So I'm going to say hello in the chat and you should see it blinking orange and you can respond by sharing a few little facts about yourself. So I'd love to know where in the world are you joining us from today? And when are you hoping to take the LSAT? Anything else that you'd like to share about what brought you here to the free prep hour today? While you're doing that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Allie Bell, and I am an LSAT and GMAT instructor for Manhattan Prep. I'm also an instructor manager and the manager of training programs, and I've been working with Manhattan Prep and teaching LSAT for about 10 years now. And I took the LSAT when I was a student at Duke University. All right, we've got someone from Brooklyn. Welcome, Calgary. A couple of folks joining from Canada tonight. Awesome. Canada and Indiana. Wonderful. Looks like we have a lot of people planning to take the test in April. Deanna, planning to take it when your score is high enough. Oh, I know that can be so hard to just wait and see, but that also can be a really great plan to make sure that you achieve your goals. Hi, Holly, welcome from Texas. Hi, Sharon. Raleigh, North Carolina. Hey, you're not too far from my alma mater. Awesome. So let's go ahead and get started. Before I dive into today's content, I just wanted to share a few additional options if you're looking for more free study resources. Two of my favorites are, first, you can actually sit in on a live LSAT class, session 1, for free with any of our instructors. You can go onto our website to see our current course schedule. All of our classes are currently running online. And you can join the first session of the class as what's called a trial student, where you get to fully participate and engage in the lesson and get 3 hours of excellent instruction in logic games, logical reasoning, and LSAT fundamentals. Another great free option is what's called Lsat Interact. That's available on our website. And it is a really cool interactive video series that features our instructors teaching common LSAT concepts and then presenting you with LSAT problems to try. And what I love about it is that it provides adaptive feedback. So if you input, say, answer choice C, and you get the question wrong, you'll get different feedback than you would have if you had gotten the question right. So the link is here if you are interested in checking that out. All right, so let's talk about what's on the agenda for today. Today, we're actually going to focus on the nuts and bolts of studying for the LSAT. I think it's really wonderful to come to these free prep hours and learn a little bit of content, but I think of that as kind of the equivalent of giving you the fish rather than teaching you to fish for yourself. And so today I want to teach you to fish for yourself by offering some guidance on what our instructors and what I personally have done to achieve a strong LSAT score and what I've seen be effective for many of our students, so that you can walk away today and use your knowledge to help yourself set up effective LSAT study sessions that will help you achieve your goal score. I find that students tend to have a lot of questions about this. So I invite you to blow up the chat today as we get through these different topics. Feel free to share your struggles. Let me know what you've been doing in your study sessions if you want some feedback on it. I'd love to hear from you. So the 5 things that we're going to talk through today are, first, building a study schedule, and we're going to particularly talk about some of the challenges around finding time and motivation to study. Second, we're going to talk about this fancy sounding thing called interleaving topics, which is a best practice for studying that's kind of something a lot of people don't know about because it's a little different from how we might have learned in school. Third is mastery-oriented rather than completion-oriented studying. Fourth is the review principle of how much time you should spend reviewing. And fifth is how to track your progress. And what I love about the conversation we're going to have today is that I don't think this is a collection of obvious study tips, but I do think this is a collection of very important, game-changing study tips. When I put this lesson together, I thought, what are the major things that would really make an impact in helping someone get to their goal score faster? And these are the things that came to mind, but they're often very different from the way we've sort of been trained to study. All right, I see my first question coming in from Madison. Thank you. How do a student's practice test generally compare to the test day score? How closely will a test day score resemble PT's? Is this affected by the LSAT changing to LSAT Flex? Great questions. So, sorry, I accidentally clicked one too many X's and I lost my screen share. Give me 1 second. So your practice tests are the best indicator that you have of what I think of as a score range that you might get on your test day. So I think of practice tests not as a clear guarantee of what your score will be, but more something that can help you predict where your score might generally fall. So let's say your last two practice tests before you take the LSAT were 168 and a 169. Because the LSAT changes from test to test, not of course in the sections that are on it, but the particular content of a reading comp passage might be different, or you might get a different collection of games types on one test than you did on your most recent practice test. It's possible that you'll score a couple points lower than you have on your most recent practice test. It's also possible that you'll score a couple of points higher. So if you were in a 168, something could happen on test day that would bump your score down below that. Or you could have an exceptionally good day and your score would bump up that. I've seen both of those things happen, and honestly, pretty wildly in both directions. For me personally, I think on test day, I scored about 10 points higher than I ever had on any of my practice tests. I've also had students score 10 points lower than they ever had on any of their practice tests. And I think that both of those phenomena speak to the importance of having a great test day plan for managing your emotions, managing unexpected things that may arise, and being prepared for any challenges that come up on that test day. One of the biggest factors that can impact performance on test day is jitters, anxiety about taking the test. And that's a really common reason that students underperform. Another reason that students sometimes underperform is because they have been concentrating in their studying for like 2 weeks prior to the test on just one area. Maybe they've only been doing logic games, so they're not feeling well-versed in all of the sections on the test. So you can avoid that by having a well-planned, well-balanced study plan, and also by proactively working to learn strategies to manage anxiety well before your test day. If you know that you are someone who tends to feel really nervous to the point that it interferes with your performance on tests, then you want to start learning now about different strategies like mindfulness and meditation and exercise and breathing techniques that can help you prepare to handle that effectively on test day. So in short, kind of really varies widely how your practice test will compare to your test day score. There's no guarantee that you'll perform in the same way. And how long do students typically study to obtain their goal score? Again, it's a pretty wide range. We generally recommend that students plan to study for 3 to 6 months prior to the LSAT, but a lot of that depends on how far you are from your goal score coming into test day. All right, so I'm going to dive back in and screen share once more. And let's get into our first topic, building a study schedule. So one of the questions that I get a lot from students is, how much should I be studying? So down here is the benchmark that we give students who are taking the Manhattan Prep Complete Course, which is that you should be studying for about 15 to 20 hours per week. And what I've done here is created an example of one hypothetical schedule for how someone might find that time to study in a week. Many students have shared with me if they're working full-time jobs or they're a full-time student, that what they do is they squeeze in a little bit of studying before their commitments for the day start. And then they also squeeze in a little bit of studying in the evening. And that's what you see reflected in this schedule. There are a few other principles reflected in this schedule. One is that you should be studying a mix of topics every day. That's called interleaving. So a lot of students think that the best way to study is to do like, okay, this whole week I'm going to do logic games, or Monday and Tuesday are logic games only. But that actually runs counter to the best ways that our brains learn, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So when you plan out your study schedule, of course, you might have different times that you enter into your calendar than the ones listed here, but you do want to be thoughtful about how you're spaced your studying for all 3 sections of the test. The only exception to that is that sometimes students have differing needs for how much time they should be spending on each section. So occasionally I'll meet a student who logic games really clicks for them and they rarely miss any questions on logic games, but they have a lot of room for growth in logical reasoning. So for that student, they might adjust their schedule so that they don't have a lot of logic games work, maybe a couple of days they do a section of logic games just to maintain their edge. And most of their study time is devoted towards their areas of weakness. If you're early on in your studying, you want to devote most of your time to your areas of weakness. If you're generally kind of performing roughly the same across the board, then you should have a pretty balanced spectrum. As you get closer to your test day, particularly in the last 2 to 3 weeks before your test day, you should be in review mode and you should be making sure that you're working through all 3 topics. A few other pieces of advice. Many people who are studying for the LSAT have a lot of other things on their plates that can take up their energy. Keep in mind that you are going to learn most effectively when you are well rested, well fed, and feeling motivated. So if you're trying to study from 10 p.m. to midnight and you're falling asleep while you're studying over your LSAT books, you're likely not learning very much. Now, that's not to say that can't work. Some people's brains work really well from 10 p.m. to midnight. But you want to pick times where you are going to be awake and rested enough to learn the material. And that is generally not the case when you're tired. What I've found when studying for standardized tests is the best thing I can do for myself if I'm really losing focus, not concentrating, super sleepy, or just frustrated, is to just be in touch with myself and say, you know what, I'm done for the day. I'm going to get some rest so that tomorrow I can come back at this feeling better. Schedule your planned study time on your calendar. So if you have a calendar for work or a personal calendar, both of those really, block off the time on your calendar and treat it like you would any other commitment, like you would a scheduled meeting or a doctor's appointment. That time is dedicated to studying and you don't give it up to other things. The temptation to that happens a lot is, you know, I have 2 hours scheduled to study on Tuesday, but then a friend calls and says, hey, can we catch up over Zoom on Tuesday? And they suggest my study time. And I say, yeah, studying's flexible. And I just push it off and hang out with my friend. But in doing that, if I do that too much, obviously I'm not going to end up meeting my goals and it'll be stressful. So you want to try to honor these commitments that you make to yourself. It's also helpful to that end to not be overly ambitious about how much you're going to study. I'm very guilty of that, where I'll kind of plan to fill every waking hour of my day with something productive and then just find myself totally burnt out, or I have no extra time to deal with unexpected things that arise. So you kind of want to expect the unexpected. And you can see how I have a couple of days built in here where there's less time studying. Like Friday is only 1 hour, Thursday's a little bit shorter, Sunday, you know, if I have the whole day off, I'm only going to study for 2 hours, or I might even take the whole day as a rest day. And building those in makes it more manageable for you to get through those longer days, because you know you have shorter days where you can take care of other stuff. And finally, it's common for folks to set up a study schedule and then fall short of it. And then the decision you have to make is, am I going to just keep setting up the same study schedule every week and falling short of it? Or am I going to revise my study schedule based on my experience? So what I would encourage you to do is, at the end of each week, look back at what you planned to do that week. And then what did you actually do that week? How much time did you actually invest? And reflect on that. Do you think that the time that you invested was too little and maybe you need to make some different decisions next week about competing priorities? Or do you feel like, no, actually, I did the best I could and this was just all the time I had, and maybe I need to adjust my expectations? All right, I see a question in the chat. How much prep do I recommend for the writing sample? Honestly, not a lot. The writing sample is considered much less important than your actual LSAT score in terms of your law school admissions process. And so I would recommend taking, maybe like 5 hours over the course of your whole LSAT study to familiarize yourself with what to expect and run through a practice essay or two. But I would not make that a major portion of your study. Other questions? Yeah, no problem. Okay. So let's talk about the common thing that happens when you're doing long-term studying for a standardized test, which is that sometimes it's hard to find the time or it's hard to find the motivation. I've been there. A couple of years ago, I took the GMAT, which is a test that similarly, like the LSAT, requires a lot of long-term study time. And at the time, I was working full-time as a public school teacher. I was also teaching LSAT classes in the evening for Manhattan Prep. And I had, social commitments. I was planning a move. And so I really struggled, and I had to learn some lessons the hard way about how to find time to prepare for a standardized test. So here are some of the things that I did that my students have also found helpful. First, when you share your goals with your family and friends, it can be incredibly powerful for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it helps people to be more considerate and understanding of why you might have a little bit less time than you normally would. I'm studying for the LSAT. It's really important to me right now. It's going to take me a few months, and I'm going to be kind of that friend who's missing for a little while. But I really appreciate your understanding, and I'll be there when my studying is over. That also helps to build your motivation and accountability, because your friends and your family will ask you, how is your LSAT studying going? Or, are you planning to do some studying this weekend? And you can share about your progress with folks who are part of your support network. That's really important. By the same token, I found myself having to be really creative about how to combine studying with other activities. So I did want to see my friends while I was studying for a standardized test. So what I did was I said, hey, I need to study, but would y'all like to get together? And obviously this was, pre-pandemic, but I say, would y'all like to get together and bring some of your own work that you need to do, and I'll study and you work, and we all just kind of hang out together in the same room and have coffee or have dinner together. And that lots of people are very busy, as it turns out. So people really liked that idea of being able to connect a little bit while also working towards their own goals. Sometimes you might have to be creative and combine LSAT studying with eating lunch or with eating dinner, or even with kind of some of your downtime. Maybe you're going through flashcards while also you've got a TV show going on in the background. It doesn't all, studying doesn't always have to be, I sit down for 2 or 3 hours and nothing else happens besides LSAT studying. That can be a really overwhelming way to think about it. Studying can be, I am, in the boring part of a meeting where I don't have to talk, so I'm kind of sneaking some flashcards on the sly. Or, if you are commuting right now, Maybe I'm riding the train and I am doing a little bit of studying on the train. All right, let me see, I see something in the chat. Starting practice drills and practice tests and wondering how to schedule time between readings and practice, especially those areas I'm struggling with. Great question. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute when I finish up with this topic. So you've probably heard this third one as it relates to exercise. Anything that you're struggling to get yourself to do, a great way to get started with it is to say, I'm just going to do 10 minutes. Like, I don't feel like doing this right now. I'm just going to sit down. I'm going to do 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, if I really don't want to be doing it anymore, I'm done. And what happens a lot of the time is you get over that inertia barrier and you get into actually doing some work and you find that you don't even notice when 10 minutes has gone by. But also you can totally give yourself permission to just quit after 10 minutes and come back to it if you're not feeling it in that moment. One thing that my students have found really helpful is joining a study group. That's an incredibly powerful motivation tool. If you're really struggling to find time to study, one thing to do is to really explicitly reprioritize. Sometimes we have things on our calendar and we kind of don't think too consciously about why they're there or how important or urgent they are. But oftentimes when we look at our calendar for a week, we might see, there might be 3 or 4 things on my calendar that really don't have to happen right now. Like maybe I can reschedule this appointment that I made, or maybe I have this project that I'm trying to work on, but you know what, it's just not the best time for me to do that project. Or maybe, my home is going to be a little bit messier while I study for the LSAT because I don't have as much time to do chores right now. That sometimes it's just what it takes to achieve a really high goal for ourselves. And finally, remind yourself of why you're doing this. If you start to lose your motivation, I think a great thing to do is to go to the website of your favorite law school and start browsing and dreaming about the programs that you want to join, or do a little research on the type of law that you're interested in studying, or speak to a person who inspires you to become a lawyer, and remind yourself of why this is important to you. All right, let me answer those questions. So if you are thinking about how to balance your study time between reading and practice, I think the biggest thing to focus on is having what we call a mastery orientation. And that takes a combination of both reading and practice. So when you're going through reading, you want to make sure that you are reading actively and that you're thinking about, what am I getting out of this? And that should affect how much time you spend doing the reading. So if you're reading and you're like, yeah, this is making sense, or I already know this, then you might want to move a little more quickly through that reading and on to the practice. Practice is generally best once we have learned a skill and we're prepared to use it. So let's say a great tool, I think, is if you're not sure, how should I be balancing this? Let's say the skill you're working on this week is flaw questions. And so you're like, I don't really know how to balance my time with flaw questions. So what I might do is actually start with what I call a diagnosis, where I just sit down and I do 10 flaw questions and I see how they go. And maybe I get 10 out of 10 and I'm like, hey, this is actually something that I already have some prior experience that I'm bringing to the table. I don't need as much work on this. And so I might try skipping the reading, moving to the practice, and seeing how well I can do on the practice. And maybe I just get to skip that reading altogether. But maybe I go through those 10 flaw questions and I get 2 out of 10 right. So then I say, okay, there's a lot for me to learn here. Then I'm going to spend a good amount of time on the reading before I move into the practice. What I'm talking about here is the balance between like reading a chapter in a strategy guide and doing practice problems. And so I think a general good rule of thumb is that you should be sort of doing one question type at a time. So I wouldn't, for example, read an entire book on logical reasoning before I go do any practice problems. I would read a chapter on flaw questions, and then I would crack open a few practice exams and find some flaw questions and answer them and track my progress, and then move on to the next chapter. The other big component of this that I saw in that question is practice tests. So practice tests, I would say when you're sort of early in your study journey, you might take them every 3 weeks or so. And then as you get close to the test date, so maybe you're like 2 or 3 weeks out, then you would start taking them every couple of days. A common mistake for students to make is to do just lots and lots of practice tests early on. And the challenge with that is if you think about all of the skills that go into a practice test, there's like 100 things that are being tested on any one LSAT exam. And so they're really not a teaching tool for the most part. They're an assessment tool to check up and see how you're doing. And there's too much going on for us to learn a lot from any one practice test. So you want to instead cycle those into your study when you're ready to check up to see how your progress is coming. But you need to give yourself some time to do active reading of strategy guides and more focused mini practice before you build up to that test. Let me know if you have follow-up questions. I see one from Mitchell when you said 3 to 6 months to study on average. What is the total study hours that is suggested? Mitchell, it's 15 to 20 hours per week. So that would be multiplied by, what is that, like 12 to 24 weeks. I can't do the math in my head right now. So I'll let you do that, but that's how I would think about the amount of study time. All right. Let's move on to the next study tip. Okay, so I mentioned when I showed you that study schedule that it's a good idea to incorporate multiple sections of the LSAT on one day of studying. And that is called interleaving. And it's something that there is a lot of learning science research to back up. So here's what learning science says. It says that rather than spending a whole day or a whole week focused on just flaw questions, your brain is going to do better if you spend some time on flaw questions, but also maybe some time on relative ordering games and some time on inference questions. And your brain is also going to do better if when you're working on flaw questions, you incorporate maybe 1 or 2 problems that touch on a topic you worked on the week before, maybe sufficient assumptions. And the reason for that has to do with difficulty. There's this logical fallacy that many of us experience with studying, where if I sit down and I say, you know what, over the next 2 days, I am just going to focus on different types of logical flaws. I'm going to memorize them all. I'm going to practice finding them. We're going to feel like we've gotten really good at that because over 2 days, it's all right in front of us. We're super familiar with it. It's fresh in our brains. And so we're going to start to really notice those flaws when we see them. But if you check back in with us a week later or 2 weeks later, we're not going to retain very much of that information because now it's been 7 days since we used it. So when it feels easy, it seems like we're learning, but we're doing short-term learning that doesn't stick. Our brains actually remember things better in the long term when it's hard for us to retrieve that information. And one way that we can make it hard for ourselves to retrieve that information is to learn something for a little bit, step away from it and focus on something else, and then come back and be like, hey, remember those flaws we worked on yesterday or 3 hours ago? Can you still remember them? Can you still name those flaws? Can you still identify those flaws? And I bet y'all are familiar with that feeling of like, okay, you were in class a week ago, you come back a week later and the teacher's like, what did we learn last week? And you're like, oh, trying to pull it out from the back of your brain. I know that feeling. But that process, that thing you're doing in that moment of pulling it out from the back of your brain makes your brain grab it longer for the long term. So it feels in the moment like you actually haven't learned that much, but by going through the struggle, you're allowing yourself to learn more. So the practical application of this is just to make sure that you're constantly mixing up topics, both between old material that you studied a week or two ago and your current material, and then also between the actual content that you're studying, from logical reasoning to logic games to reading. Thanks, Mitchell. Mitchell's saying you've heard 1,000 hours is a good goal to prepare. Yeah, I haven't really ever put it in terms of hours, so I'd have to do that math to figure that out. We usually think about it more in terms of like months of dedicated studying here. And that's kind of for this reason, right? Like 1,000 hours is not the same if you cram it all into a really short period as it is if you space it over a longer period of time. And also the quality of your studying makes a huge difference. My goal is for you to not have to study 1,000 hours, and that's why I'm sharing these tips with you about what would make for an effective study plan. All right, so next tip is really, really important one. If you take nothing else from this session today, take this away. Mastery-oriented study is a mindset that you can bring into your studying to make it much more effective. So many of us, when we sit down for a study session, have either a time-oriented goal for that session or a completion-oriented goal. And that's normal, right? So you might say to yourself, I'm going to study for 2 hours today, and that's my goal. And if I do it, I'll feel good. Or I'm going to finish this chapter of the book, and that's my goal. And that's kind of what I'm hearing in some of the questions that we're asking too, right? It's our brains want to know, like, just tell me how many hours am I going to study, and that's going to be enough. I'm going to get this score. But unfortunately, because we're all different, learning doesn't quite work that way, where we can say, I can guarantee you that if you study 2 hours a day for 6 months, you will get your goal score. Instead, what I can guarantee you is if you write down all the lists of skills that are required by the LSAT, and you work on each of those skills until you have mastered it, you'll get a pretty good score on the LSAT. And that's the mindset that you want to have when you're planning your studying. So when you sit down for an LSAT study session, you want to set a goal that you can measure and a goal that if you accomplish it will mean you have mastered some skill that is critical to the LSAT. So you've gone from I can do this 20% of the time to I can do this 90% of the time. Here are a couple of examples. There's a particular tool that we teach for necessary assumption questions called the negation test. So an example for a goal for a single study session might be, I'm going to be able to, by the time I'm done here, like right now, negation test makes no sense to me, but I'm going to sit down and I'm going to stick with this until I understand the negation test well enough to use it to answer 80% of necessary assumption questions correctly. And that might be a goal that's going to take me 15 minutes. And then I'm like, great, I'm done for the day. And it might be a goal that I don't achieve by the end of my study session. So the important thing here is because I'm not doing a time-oriented goal, I don't give up on that, right? I get to the end of my session and I'm like, okay, I'm not quite there. And I know I have to get there to achieve my goal. So I'm going to do one of two things. I'm either going to keep working on this goal tomorrow, or I'm going to note down somewhere that this is a skill that I still need to master, and I'm going to plan to come back to it. And either of those is fine. You don't have to stick with every single goal for as long as it takes to master it. But you do need to master a lot of the skills in order to do well on the LSAT. Another example of a mastery-oriented goal would be, I will be able to diagram conditional logic correctly 100% of the time. And you would just check this by doing drills out of an LSAT study book and checking your accuracy against those drills. Yeah, no problem at all. All right. Questions about this concept of mastery-oriented studying? All right. And if you're putting them in the chat, I'll keep an eye out for them. But what I'd like to do now is actually give us an opportunity to try what it looks like to have an effective little study session. And so we are going to do a set of 4 logical reasoning problems. Ideally, if this were your study session, you would have picked out these problems for a particular reason, right? So you're not just randomly doing logical reasoning. You're like, okay, I'm going to work on, assumption family questions because on my last practice test, that was my weakest area. So I know I have a lot of room for growth. Or like my goal with these 4 logical reasoning questions is to focus on my timing. So I'm going to pick, in this case, 4 questions from the earlier, easier section of the test and try to do what we call a pace pusher, where I make myself go as fast as I can on these questions. Because there's a lot of us and I didn't know you all in advance of today, I just went ahead and picked 4 logical reasoning problems. 3 of them come from the assumption family, and 1 of them is an example of interleaving. So it's not in the assumption family, but it's kind of mixing up those topics. What I'd like for you to think about before we go through the problems is, what will your goal be for these problems? And I'll give you a few examples, and you can feel free to just choose one of these, since I know it's hard to know how to set a goal for problems that you didn't pick. So a great example of a goal would be a process-oriented goal. So thinking about the steps you should take on logical reasoning questions. For example, one big one is to always read the question first, because you want to have your task in mind as you read the stimulus. So that could be your goal, like the only thing you're going to measure your success on for these 4 questions. Another one could be, anytime this is a question type that's going to have a conclusion, my goal is to make sure I clearly identify the conclusion and accurately. Or you could have a goal that's focused on the answer choices. So one thing that comes up a lot in the LSAT world is language strength. So you could say, my goal is going to be to focus on noticing when there are strong words like only or most or always showing up in the answer choices. So take a moment to set a goal for yourself and write it down. I'm just going to be quiet. You don't need to tell it to me, but just write it down somewhere for you. Right. And the way we're going to do this is just so that the problems are visible, I'm going to have to put one on the screen at a time, which means I will have to be the one kind of moving the problems along. And it's possible that I'm going to move them faster than the pace that you're working at today. So I apologize in advance if that's the case for you. That's just kind of one of the downsides of, having to work through this all together online. But I am going to give you about 1.5 minutes per problem. And I'll let you know when there are 10 seconds left before I'm going to switch. So in that 10 seconds, that's your cue to go ahead and just, however much you've eliminated down to, go ahead and pick the answer that you would choose in that moment on the test if you needed to move on. One thing you'll notice about these goals that I set is that none of them are, I'm going to get 100% of these problems right. And that's because goals like that are more outcome oriented than process oriented. So they don't really give us much opportunity to learn, right? If that's my goal, then I'm just trying to do my best at everything. And that's not actually going to help me get better at anything. So what I want to have is a process oriented goal, not an outcome oriented goal, so that my goal itself is helping me learn. It's helping me practice something specific. All right, so I'm going to put the questions on the screen. I'll be quiet and I'll be off camera, but I'm still here, so feel free to chat me if you need anything. And I will just let you know on the mic how the timing is going. All right, here is your first problem. 10 seconds on this problem. Ten seconds. Ten seconds. Ten seconds. All right, that's it. So we are going to talk now about how you should review those problems. And I'm actually going to give you a little bit of homework. Rather than explaining each of those problems to you, I'm going to teach you how to review them and then encourage you to go review them after this session has ended. So let's talk about what you should do. So first of all of these problems are from LSAT Practice Test 65, Section 4. We did problems 1, 2, 3, and 5. So if you'd like to jot that down so that you can reference that later, I'm going to show you some places where you can look for explanations in just a minute. So again, it's in the bottom left corner here, Prep Test 65, Section 4. We did problems 1, 2, 3, and 5. All right, so let's talk about how you should review a practice set like that. So the first thing I want to share is this surprising review principle. Most people think that when we study, we should spend most of our time doing practice problems. But the thing is that the doing of the problems itself isn't as much of a learning exercise as a testing exercise. The learning comes from the goal setting that we do before, and then the quality review of the problems that we do after, when we take the time to figure out why the wrong answers were wrong, what the logical structure of the argument was, and what patterns there are we can use on future questions. For that reason, we recommend that you spend actually at least twice as much time reviewing problems as you spent doing them. So we spent 6 minutes doing that problem set. You should spend minimally 12 minutes, possibly 18 minutes, or possibly even more, depending on how that set went for you, reviewing it. And let's talk about some ways to do that effectively. So first step, reflect on your goal. I'm going to give you some space to do that right now. So take a look at the goal that you set for yourself that you wrote down before this set. And think about how you did with it. And if you'd like to share, put it in the chat. How did you do in terms of your goal from what you can tell so far? Some of you might be thinking, well, I don't know, because I don't know which problems I got right or wrong. But the hallmark of an effective goal is that you often will be able to tell how you did without knowing whether you got the problems right or wrong, because your goal is more specific than just, did I get the problem right or did I get it wrong? You should know whether, if you set your goal as read the question before you read anything else, then you should be able to tell that by the end of your set, because that's a process goal, regardless of how well you did in terms of the answers. Cool, that's great to hear, Mitchell. So the second step that you want to do is what we call a blind review. And this is something that I would encourage you to do after the workshop today, and I'll show you what it looks like. So a blind review is where, now that I'm off the clock, I go back through these problems untimed. I do not yet check my answers, but I go back and I kind of remind myself, how did I feel about each of these problems? And for any of the problems where I felt a little unsure, I do a really slow, thoughtful deep dive into that problem to see if I want to change my answer before I know what the correct answer is. Then once I've done that, I now look at the answers, and I will give you the answers for these questions so you can check your work. So the answer to the first question was C. The second question was E. The third question was D. And the last question was B. So now that I know what the answers are, I just mark whether I got each question right or wrong, and then I kind of set the answers aside. I'm not really looking at them. So I'm going to clear them off the screen. And I go back to the ones that I know that I got wrong, and I see if I can figure them out on my own without the crutch of looking at the specific answer. So maybe I got number 3 wrong. Cool, I'm not looking at the answer, I just marked it wrong. Now I'm going to go back and see if I can figure out what was wrong with my answer choice. and what do I think the next best answer would be. And then finally, once I've done that, I look up an explanation. So the idea of this blind review process is for you to do as much of the work of solving the problem in your own brain as you can, because we learn by doing. And so having an active process of kind of treating these problems like a puzzle and trying to solve it and figure out what might have gone wrong for me as I was solving this puzzle is what your brains are going to remember best. Now, you do want to call in backup. It sometimes is the case that we don't know what we don't know when we're studying for a new standardized test. So after I've gone through the blind review and I either think I've worked everything out or I've worked some stuff out, but there's still some stuff that I'm just like, that doesn't really make sense to me. Then I look up the explanations and I put a little link there. And this is to our LSAT Forums. So I'm going to share those with you now. And I'm going to put this link in the chat too. So this is a great resource on our website that provides answer explanations to all of the, well, not necessarily all, but to almost all of the LSAT questions that have been published. We try to keep up with as many of them as we can. And so here you can see there are answer explanations for practice test 65. And so I'll go in here and, I'll look for an official post. Patrick was one of our LSAT writers for a long time. And I'll use Patrick's explanation and compare it to what I came up with and see if Patrick thought about any of these answer choices differently than me or has any insights that I might want to take away from this process. I see a question in the chat about the difficulty level of those problems. So those were from the first 5 questions of the logical reasoning section, which tend to be the lowest in difficulty throughout the section. So I didn't look up the individual item difficulty, but on average, those questions are likely to be a little bit lower in difficulty. So I check out Patrick's explanation and then I go back and I record my learning and I track my progress. Those are different things. So when I record my learning, I am writing down what I want to take away from that problem so that I can get future problems like that correct. And one way to do that is to have a review log. So a lot of the students that come through Manhattan Prep for tutoring or class use a review log to track their learning from different questions that they've worked on. And you can see an example here of one of those spreadsheets. You enter in, you record what test it was and what question number so you can find it later. You keep track of the types of questions. And then in particular, you write a thoughtful reflection about what was being tested, how did you get tricked, what did you miss, what do you want to change in your approach for later. And then you make a plan to try that question in the future and to track your mastery of that question. What I love about this approach is that it helps make our mistakes useful. Every mistake that you make when you're studying for the LSAT, and there will be a lot of them, is a learning opportunity. So you want to make sure that you capitalize on that learning. And a lot of folks try to capitalize on that learning by going through steps 1 through 3. And then they read the explanation, they say, cool, I get it, the end. What happens then is they get it in that moment, but because they didn't take the time to put it in their own language and encode it in their own brains, they won't necessarily recall it the next time they're faced with a similar situation. One of the most powerful things that we can do to help ourselves remember something is to generate it in our own words. So to say it out loud or to write it down rather than copying it or just passively reading it. So a review log might feel tedious at times, but that's what it's forcing you to do. It's forcing you to pinpoint what exactly was the one thing that caused me to get this question wrong that I will not do in the future. Then I'm going to articulate what I learned and what I want to change. And then I'm also going to hold myself accountable for actually making that change. I'm going to believe in myself by setting a retry date so that when I come back to that question later, I can make sure that I actually learned from that question. Right, I see a couple comments in the chat. Lenny, I don't know actually that I can share this review log. You're welcome to take a screenshot of what I've got here. But our review log is a resource that we typically give to students when they sign up for tutoring or for a class. And I don't think it's one of our free resources that I can just share out, unfortunately. But I'll leave it up here for a second if anyone wants to take a review or take a screenshot. Okay, so you've tracked or you've recorded your learning. Last thing is track your progress. This is a little bit different from recording your learning. This is about taking your performance on that last set of questions and thinking about how it fits into your overall long-term study plan. So I mentioned that the way you want to think about preparing for the LSAT is not in terms of, I need to complete X number of hours and then I'm good to go. It's, I need to learn this long list of skills and put them together and then I'm good to go. And so one thing that you should be trying to pay attention to and track throughout your studies is what are those skills that are showing up on your practice tests or in your problem sets that are being tested on the LSAT that you still need to learn or you still need to work on. You should have a list of those somewhere, and then you should be keeping yourself accountable for checking in with your progress. So here's an example of what that might look like. This is for logic games, and this is a set of skills that a student might need to work on. So maybe they need to work on hybrid diagrams, framing the question, cracking the code on unusual ordering setups. The typical list for a student would be much longer than this actually, but it helps to have kind of some short-term lists that you're focused on for a month or so. So I might go in, and on February 9th today, I might check up on this by doing a practice section of logic games and give myself a little rating here. So maybe I'll give myself a check, if I was able to master the hybrid diagram that showed up on that particular logic game section. Maybe I'll have a symbol for when I kind of do this, like a little squiggly line, like sometimes I remember to frame the question, but I can still work on it. And maybe I'll put in a little X for things that I just totally didn't do at all on this section. And then I can continue to track my progress and hopefully get some of these skills to a place where they're just checks across the board and winnow down the list of things that I need to be focused on in my mastery-oriented study sessions. All right, folks, that is what I wanted to share with you. I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to take a couple more questions. We've got about 2 minutes left. If you're interested in seeing more about Manhattan Prep and trying out one of our courses, you can check them out using the link there. I have a course that's coming up in March. So if you're interested in working with me a little bit more, you can feel free to check that out. You can also feel free to reach out to me via email. My email address is abell@manhattanprep.com if you'd like to talk a little bit more about what you heard tonight or about our upcoming courses. Sharon asks, is Khan Academy a good studying tool? I can't say much about it in the sense that I haven't explored their LSAT resources in particular. Let's see. Additional tips for 2 weeks leading up to test day. Yeah, I can share a couple of tips. So the big thing that you should be doing at that point is basically a cycle of practice, tests, and review. So the way I would think about it is like maybe on day 1, I take a practice test, then I spend a day reviewing that practice test. Maybe I spend a day brushing up on skills that practice test revealed some gaps in. And then day 4, I'm back to taking another practice test. The last couple of days before your test, you want to stop taking practice tests. So pick a cutoff point where you're like, okay, after the Wednesday before my test, I'm not doing any more practice tests. And then the final day before the test and the day of, you want to focus primarily on relaxing and getting into the right mindset for the test rather than cramming. Alyssa, I can't speak to that. Those are decisions that are made by the LSAC, and MPrep isn't privy to any additional knowledge about that. All right, It is time. Thank you all so much for coming. It was lovely to work with you today, and good luck with your LSAT studying.